Hello and welcome to Workplace Shift. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Do you know what drives your decisions? How do you select people you want to hire? How do you choose what you like? How do you form your opinion for or against something? Are you biased? Is there such a thing as unconscious bias, and is it necessarily bad or simply part of our human existence and learning experience? This is what I'll explore in this episode of Workplace Shift with my guest, an unconscious bias specialist and trainer, a multi-talent, proud graduate of Howard University and accomplished speaker, LaTonya Pegues. She owns a consulting firm that specializes on high-impact bias training. Her firm is based in Austin, Texas, and Los Angeles. She has delivered a keynote last year at South by Southwest. Welcome to Workplace Shift, LaTonya. And LaTonya is joining us today via Skype from Austin, Texas.
Thanks, Nicolette. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So unconscious bias is obviously a big topic. So let's start right with the basics here. Bias. Why is bias these days so important? Why are we talking about it so much?
Well, I think it's good actually to start with the definition of what is bias.
Yep. Go ahead.
I think it's important to start with the definition of what is bias. What is bias? How is it unconscious? And they're basically social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals from outside form their own conscious awareness. So it's also, the bottom line, stereotypes that people create without even realizing it. So the thing about it is that all biases aren't actually negative. Say, for example, what you decided to wear today, what I decided to wear today. That's not necessarily a negative bias, but some of the negative biases actually come as a result of wrong information, misinformation. Not all the information is shared. Sometimes as executives and leaders, we know certain things that the people who report to us don't know. And so as a result of that, those folks may experience some bias because they don't understand the full picture.
Yeah.
And then also...
So I pulled a definition from the internet today, and it says a bias is what we're unaware of, happens automatically, and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments of people and situations influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experience. So there's a lot of trigger points, I guess. But what I would like to get to is also, how are we affected by bias in our daily life? What are decisions we're making where you really say that's a bias?
Well, one bias could be actually in hiring practices. So some people like to hire folks who are just like them, or who have certain types of experience, or they're excited, or they're like me, say the hiring manager. But the problem with that is that if someone is experienced, say, for example, they've got 10 years in an industry, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've been 10 great years. That just might mean that they know how to manipulate the system in order to stay hired and not fired.
Yes, I totally agree. I do want to, what's the difference, LaTonya, between bias as a general definition and unconscious bias?
Well, the unconscious bias is actually literally something that just happens that we're not even aware of. And it's something as far as like what we've been taught in all of our lives and growing up, and what our grandparents have shared with us, and what we learned in the school system. So it's basically something that's happened that has created how we think about certain things. So as a result of that, it's become a part of our being and who we are, so much so that it's an unconscious thing. So when we wake up in the morning, we just brush our teeth. We don't think about, should I brush my teeth? Should I floss? No, it's something that's a part of us, and it's just something that we do. So that's the unconscious part of it.
So but when can you, but that's not, most of it sounds like it's really a big part of the personality, but when does it turn into a negative way? I mean, you mentioned the hiring practice, and we're going to talk a little bit about the hiring practice in a few minutes. I do want to go a little deeper on that one. Let's talk about, in general, like before the hiring practices, what are other situations where bias can really come to the forefront and affect people?
Well, that's a very interesting question because it actually can happen when people have a lot of favorites, and also it can happen too at the root of something. And so the interesting thing about all these biases is that can really tear down an organization. Say, for example, if a boss or an executive or a team leader has a favorite. So when we were kids, we called it teacher's pets. So that's certainly a bias. Because if you're not the teacher's pet, then you don't get the benefit of all the things like what you could actually benefit from.
But what
so
if
in the
you
workplace,
but what if you have a favorite because that person is simply more qualified?
Well, that's something too to consider. But there's a way to actually interact with that person. If they're meeting and exceeding goals and expectations, then that's certainly something that you want to reward. But the reward shouldn't be so great that the others aren't incentivized to want to continue to move forward. And so what happens sometimes is that those people who are the favorite, not only are they doing their work well, but unfortunately they're making other decisions that aren't so good. And as a result of that, it affects the entire organization. Because, for example, they know that the boss likes them and they can get away with things that other people can't. And those things are not necessarily favorable things. So that's a way that it can become a negative within an organization. And people see that, and that affects them and their ability to want to even try harder and want to succeed.
But let me ask you something. Isn't any kind of interpretation of even judging somebody's work, for example, you have certain standards. So when you look at somebody's work, automatically you have a certain standard that each individual is looking for, because you can't just quantify it. I mean, the numbers are easy. There is no bias with numbers, right? Numbers are the bottom line. You can say these are your goals, this is what you have to achieve. There's no bias because you either reach them or you don't reach them. But what about
that's the hope, that there's no bias, but sometimes there is.
Well, yes, but what about all the quality aspects? Like when you look at certain things, there is what I'm getting at is that there is really always a subjective, personal interpretation. I'm not sure I would necessarily call that bias, though. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this one, because bias has been talked about so much and very often in a negative sense. So I think it's important for us to understand, when does bias affect something, and really you need to step away from it and kind of look objectively at a situation, or when is it just something that's just part of your personal standards?
Well, in business, a time to realize that you may need to check out some of your biases is when you're not producing, when you're not reaching your goals, when productivity is low, when morale is low, when people are quitting and they're just not happy to come to work anymore, when you can tell that folks are coming in late and leaving early. That's an example to show that there's a lot of negative bias going on. When there's a department where they just can't keep anybody and the manager's the only consistent person that's there, or the hiring person, and that gives you an idea that there's some negative stuff that's going on there that needs to be addressed. So you're absolutely right, Nicolette. Not every bit of bias is negative. For example, what did you decide to wear today? What did I decide to wear today? Did I wear pearls, or did I wear some other type of jewelry? That's not a negative bias. But the type of bias that you got to really think about is, how is it affecting our bottom line? I mean, we all go to work in order to achieve goals and to provide a wonderful product and a service. But if, as a result of our workplace, if we're shifting around in our workplace and our mindset is not one of a unified one as a result of a lot of bias, then we're just not going to reach our goals and probably not do well as an organization.
So how can you go about and determining kind of like when a bias affects something negatively? Is there a method to the madness, so to speak, LaTonya? In the workplace particularly.
Yeah, the negative bias is the big problem, especially when it comes to inclusion. So some people, for example, they only want to hire people who went to their school and university. So the challenge with that, Nicolette, is, say, for example, they all are in have the same major. So what happens? More than likely, they've had the same instructors, the same dean, the same school of thought, the same. It becomes this homogeneous way of looking at life, and there's no diversity there. And so that's a big problem. So some people's bias is, I've got to only hire for my alma mater. Well, you kind of should mix it up a little bit, because if you're only hiring people from that school of thought, then that's really it's coming into your organization. So there's no innovation there. So that's a word, of course, it's another buzzword. So the innovation doesn't come with everything being the same. It's good to mix it up a little bit.
Yes, and particularly as we get organizations ready for the 21st century, we all know that organizations need to basically hire people that are the total opposite of what they used to hire previously. So they bring in new skill sets, new mindsets, fresh way of thinking, etc. Do you have a method that you normally work with organizations in how they can bypass falling into that trap?
Well, basically, we have to just start with an assessment, because every organization is different. And there's also times when the leadership changes, then a lot of things shift. I'm aware of an organization where almost everyone at the top of the org chart has been transitioned out of the company. So as a result of that, they have to refocus their office culture as a result of the new leadership team that comes in. So then they'll have their set of biases, unfortunately. That's just, human nature. And so the culture of an organization, as well as any bias that the organization has as a result of the culture they've created, and in addition to that, any bias that the executive and the leadership team have, and the board of directors or board of trustees or board of governors, board of regents, it can really trickle down. It's amazing how it all works. Yeah. So it's a good idea to have certain standards as to, are we going to have an accountable organization? Are we going to have an ethical one, a moral one? Just certain standards to be able to set. So as they're perhaps even refocusing the office culture, there's a line there. There's a line in the sand as far as what expectations to strive for.
I think the culture part is the most difficult one, because when you try to instill a different culture, for example, and you want to break down the pattern, from my experience, the issue is that because hiring managers like to hire the same type of people, as you say, like something that triggers, the same background, the same school, the same successes or failures and things like that. I think it's really difficult to kind of dive down and break that pattern, which is why, in my case, for example, from my experience, I have asked organizations not to make hiring decisions based on resumes. So you take this right out. And we've had the experience in all of the organizations that I've worked with. For example, when you present a candidate and you just say the story of a candidate, particularly to a large group of individuals, there is more consensus on how this person generally resonates with the organization and everybody than if you have people look through the resume and they kind of start picking their favorites, or when their bias really kicks in. I do want to talk more about this. We have about 7 seconds left before we go into the break. So when we come back, we'll pick right up where we leave off right now. Thanks. Welcome back to Workplace Shift. Thanks for joining me. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Unconscious bias is gaining more importance as we head deeper into the 21st century. In the age of complexity, where whole systems thinking is the only way to successfully manage and cope with challenges and uncertainty that we're presented with, becoming aware of our own triggers and inner buttons is part of the transformation journey we're all on towards a higher evolved humanity. As you know, diversity and inclusion are buzzwords you can hear in almost every aspect of our lives, in your work environment, to politics, to simply exchanging thoughts and opinions. With me is LaTonya Pegues, an unconscious bias trainer who has her own firm, and she's joining us today from Austin, Texas. Welcome back, LaTonya, in the second segment of Workplace Shift. So when we spoke before, we talked about the big issue of bias in hiring, for example. Do you want to add something based on the previous segment? So my question really would be, based on your experience as the unconscious bias trainer, how do you influence hiring managers to branch out and in fact hire the opposite of what they would normally go for? Are you working with clients in that respect?
Yeah, well, I think it's a process, because some of these things that people are doing, they've been learning them literally all their lives. So even, for example, to even recognize bias in one's own life, that's an opportunity for, as we say, come out of denial. For example, when someone goes to Alcoholics Anonymous, they have to, at some point, recognize that there's an issue and acknowledge it. So the same goes for, in order to get help and move forward. So the same goes in the area of bias and unconscious bias. So when you're dealing with the hiring practices, there's just all these little subtle things that can happen that can make people more interested in hiring a certain type of candidate. For example, hair color, eye color, type of accent that they have. For example, a British accent, or even sports teams, or like we talked about earlier, where they went to school. All these types of things that people can look for and not even realizing that their bias is actually coming out and it's affecting their decision in a negative or positive way.
So how do you work with clients to recognize that there is a bias? That seems to be the first step, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So once they've come out of denial and they recognize it, the recognition comes when they realize that they keep hitting their head against the wall, if you will, because they're not making progress. And the thing about it, Nicolette, is that it's so important to just have a really great and honest conversation and say, hey, look, where are we failing? Why aren't we doing well? Let's look at the numbers. So to your point that you'd mentioned in the previous segment, so look for growth areas, look at those areas for growth, and have an honest, intentional, heart-to-heart conversation with the team to determine, okay, you know what, guys and gals, we're doing something different because this is not working. So that's when the intentional part of it all comes into being intentional about doing something different. And even that can be a problem because all these things that they've been learning all their lives have maybe keeping them still going the wrong direction. For example, in the technology industry, the numbers are still very low as far as being a more diverse workplace. The numbers are still not the best. And we've been talking about this for 6, 7, 8, or 9 years. And so for technology companies that can fix problems and solve things and create new opportunities for us to enjoy life better, it's interesting that it's taking them so long to be able to move forward in the area of being more inclusive. So it's really something that they should bring in outside consultants, to come in. Of course, that's a service that we provide as well, but to help them to see these blind spots, what I call them, blind spots where they aren't even aware that there's a potential issue. And so over time, we can help them with that by looking at the data, doing assessments, doing surveys, but just not for the sake of doing assessments and surveys, but with the intentionality of we're going to make some changes in a direction where we can start seeing positive change.
So how do you go about when you have a number of people on your team who don't recognize the need that you need to bring in people with the different skill sets, and there might be an issue with bias? So let's say you have some people in there, usually it's the top leadership that says we don't get the right kind of people, we need a different kind of skill set and a different kind of mindset. But then you go towards other areas within the organization, and other hiring managers may not see the need for change on this one. So how do you work? Have you worked with clients in terms of changing that, and how do you go about that?
Well, change is a process. Change does not happen overnight. Even, for example, when companies are embracing new technology, say a new software system or something that they'll use daily, there's still some opportunities for growth there because it takes a while to understand everything and figure it out. And sometimes people are like, they're resistant to change. They do not want to change, even though they're complaining about the results and about how things are. So even when it comes to dealing with the unconscious bias, and say, for example, the management and the executive team is on point for that, but then as you start going down the org chart, those individuals may not be. But that's something that perhaps could even be tied to their performance appraisal, to their compensation. So it's so interesting, Nicolette, but when you talk about certain topics, people don't value them until they see how it can affect them in their bank account.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different types of biases, because there's like a whole range of biases. Can you walk us through what type of biases there are?
Well, there's over 150.
Well, let's do the 5 top ones. How is that?
Well, for the sake of time, we're not going to do all 150. But I think just a couple of them, a handful, would be the experience bias. I think we talked about that a little bit earlier.
Yes.
And then also the like me bias.
Yes.
Oh, Nicolette, you could be on my team because, like me, you enjoy communication. So
Yeah.
you're like me, so I can resonate with you.
Yes.
Now, on a certain level, that's fine. But when we're looking to do something that's innovative and growing and big and just really going to transform the world, it's probably not a good idea to have everyone with the same background doing the same type on the same project, for example. So you have the like me bias. So that's one. And guess what? We already got one of you and one of me. So why do we need another us?
Yes.
So like me is enough. One me is enough. We don't need many me's. Another one is experience bias. He or she's been doing this for 10 or 12 years, so they must be good at it. Not necessarily so. Another bias also comes in the form of just simply favorites. Who do you like? Who's your favorite? Do they, to use an old school term, kiss up to the manager and to the boss? Are they the ones who are bringing them cookies and chocolate during this time of the year when people enjoy cookies and chocolate and hot chocolate? So there are different reasons why people try to align themselves and work with different people who are in authority in high places. And another bias that is an interesting one is one that's just simply, you're from where I'm from. You're from my neighborhood. You are from my block, if you will. Yeah. So even it could be the same city, the same state. You understand me and my culture because we're from the same place. Yeah. So those are just a couple of them, that are not necessarily all negative all the time. But when we're looking at being innovative and creating new ways of doing things, it's certainly a good idea to have people from diverse backgrounds and diverse experience on the team.
Absolutely. So I found there's actually the Virgin Group, that has like the Virgin brand. They have on their website a clear definition of biases that they kind of try to look for and try to eliminate sort of in their work environment. And I was really impressed. So they listed 5 of them, very similar to what you said. They had the affinity bias, which is the tendency to warm up to someone who's like you. They had the halo effect, the tendency to think that everything about a person is good because you like them. They have the perception bias, which is mainly based on stereotypes and assumptions, the confirmation bias that kind of seeks to confirm pre-existing ideas and assumptions about a group of people. And I think most people would probably catch themselves here and there when they kind of say, oh, I thought that person would be like that because, they come from a certain industry, for example, and this is how you would expect people to behave, something like that. And then the last one that they mentioned was groupthink, when you try too hard to fit into an existing culture and sort of hold back on your thoughts and opinions. This one I want to talk a little bit about because I find this particularly dangerous and counterproductive to innovation and creativity in an organization. So how do you determine that there is groupthink in an organization, and how do you break it up? The thinking, not the organization.
That's a good one, because some of it revolves, now there's going to be more than one answer to this, but I'll just give you my perspective.
Yes. When
it comes to groupthink, peer pressure is still a very real thing today. And it's a very real thing when certain people may feel intimidated by the person who's the loudest in the room. And I don't know if you've ever experienced it, Nicolette, but I certainly have, where someone is the loudest in the room and they just keep talking, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're coming with the best solutions. And so some people are raised to, not interrupt, to, be polite, let people finish, not to cut them off. And then, so by the time that person has done all the talking, the meeting's almost over. And so with groupthink, it's important to listen literally to the group, give the group an opportunity to share. And I have discovered through the years that sometimes it's the people in the room who say the least who got the best solutions. So it's a great idea, ladies and gentlemen, if you are the one who's always got the microphone, as I say, to share it with those who are also in the room, because they are there for a reason. They have opportunity, experience that they're bringing to the table too. So give others an opportunity to share. And when that happens, when there's this open feeling of, hey, well, wow, they're going to listen to me for a change. I actually get a chance to say something. Well, I can tell you that the pressure is going to be different as far as people feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't say anything because that person's always talking and it's really their meeting. No, all those types of stereotypes start to leave the room and people become more aware of the fact that they can share, and it's best for everybody. So groupthink can go either way. It can be one where it's like, somebody's just kind of running everything, or groupthink can be wow, it's innovative, it's awesome, and we're really being able to be more productive now.
So I want to talk a little bit about your training that you provide to companies. We have a little bit of time left, so why don't you walk us through, if I run an organization and I reach out to LaTonya Pegues, what can I expect as a client? How does a training for unconscious bias work? What's the length of it? How long does it take? How much time does it take, etc.?
Yes, well, thanks for asking that. We love to provide creative solutions for clients who are having some challenges, but then there are also some clients who are doing a great job and they want to sustain that. So what they could do, the way that we do is we have several different types. One is the training, and we recommend the training to be ongoing. It's just not something where, okay, we've had one session and that's it, we're done. No. Mm-hmm. Because we were talking about decades of learned behavior, and we need to go through sometimes layers and layers of different types of bias before we can really even start getting to a place where people understand, maybe I do need to change. Mm-hmm. So I recommend, once they engage with the training, Nicolette, they continue on with it at least every 3 months. Sometimes the whole org chart needs to go through it. Sometimes we'll train the executive team, and then from here, once they're on board and they see the value of it, then we also go to different parts of the org chart, including those people who report to everyone on the org chart. Mm-hmm. So the length of time, it could be as short as 90 minutes. And it also can be, a workshop that lasts for 3 or 4 days in order to really do an immersion of those types of exercises and conversation. And so I'm not the kind of trainer that just sits at the lectern and just talks to people for hours and hours.
Right.
No, it's interactive. We're using visual aids. We're making it fun and exciting. And we're having a fun and creative environment that's created. And so people feel more relaxed about talking about difficult things. Because let's just face it, sometimes it's hard to talk about difficult thing.
Absolutely. We are out of time. Thank you so much, LaTonya, for joining us. Now, can actually viewers find out more about the training that you provide on your website? They can?
Absolutely. Please
okay,
visit thegvtrainer.com.
Okay. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure we will continue at another time. There's so much more to dive in and talk about, and you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon. Bye-bye.